Every once in a while in photography, there comes along a camera that has a profound and almost immediate impact on the market and on photography in general. And this is one of those cameras. So this is the Olympus OM-1. Released first as the M1 in 1972, and then re-released with a new name, the OM-1, in 1973 after some concerns from Leica, in which the German camera maker felt there might be some confusion over the name of the camera being too similar to its own series of rangefinder cameras, the M series. This is the camera that went against the tide and resulted in other camera makers downsizing their full-size products. The OM-1 is significant because it not only did it appeal to amateurs, it also appealed to professional photographers. This probably was Olympus's crowning achievement when it came to breaking into the professional market. Even today, with its series of micro four thirds cameras and with the production of pro level models, it still does not command the same market presence as the OM-1 did during its heyday. So let's compare real quickly to a full size camera. This is the Pentax Spotmatic. And you can see standing shoulder to shoulder how much shorter the OM-1 is. Now, if you compare these back to back, you can also see that the OM-1 also is a much narrower camera. The lenses tended to be slightly smaller, but not vastly smaller. Olympus did a really good job of making excellent lenses that appealed to the professional photographer. In addition to its lenses, Olympus also offered many accessories such as motor drives, bulk film backs, interchangeable viewfinder screens, and other items. The early cameras did not come with a hot shoe that was integrated into the body. And so they look like this. I don't know if it was purchased as an accessory or if it was included in the box, but in any case, it was not integrated into the body like many other camera makers were doing at the time. So if you look at the top deck is a little bit different. Normally, we will see a shutter speed dial here. In this case, it is a film speed dial. Over here is your meter switch on off. The earliest cameras also used the mercury cell, no longer available. And I believe if you try to use a 1.5 volt battery today, there is some exposure compensation that you have to handle because of the difference in voltage. The older battery would have been 1.35 volts, and the newer silver oxide or lithium batteries, they provide generally 1.5 volts and sometimes a bit more. So it's enough of a voltage difference that you would have to compensate. Over here is a rewind crank. It's actually oversized a bit, and that's always a good thing. Here's your shutter release. The shutter release did not have a lock. And your frame counter is right here. This is your film advance. It was ratcheted so you could advance the film in short increments. And to change your film speed, you would pull the film advance lever to what we call its standoff position. Press this button, and then you could turn the dial. There's a small indicator, a small little red line here, and that indicates your selected film speed. You had a pretty wide range here with the film speeds running from 1600 down to 25. Remember, this was before 3200 speed film was available. For 1600 speed film, it generally was Tri-X push several stops. On the front of the camera, it's a little bit different once again. This is your rotating rewind lever. So when you finished the roll and you wanted to rewind, you would just push that in that direction and rewind your film. This small lever here is a mirror lockup. Let's first detach the lens. And so this is a bayonet mount, but there's no lens release button or lever on the body. To remove the lens, it's different from other cameras, but still simple. It's similar, although not identical, to what you see on the Pen F half-frame cameras. You have these ears. Each of them plays a role. This is the one that you press to remove the lens. You simply press it, turn the lens, and it comes off. This is a 3-low bayonet, as are most or possibly all bayonet mounts. I don't know that there are any two lobe ones, I'm not going to actually say, because as soon as I say there were no two lobe lens mounts, somebody will say, well, what about such and such? All right. To mount a lens, simply you want to take your focus mark as a small dot and line it up with this red dot on the lens mount. Put those two together, twist to the right, and the lens locks into place. Now we know this button, this small depressible tab, is for removing the lens. What about this one? This is a depth of field preview, and you'll see what I mean. It should actually snap open a little quicker. Let's take a look on the other lens that I have mounted here to the OM-2. That one's a little quicker, so that would indicate that this lens should be serviced. So as I mentioned, this is a small mirror lockup lever. Just twist that and the mirror locks up. That would be for certain applications in which you either needed to possibly to eliminate camera vibration, or for whatever purpose you needed to do it. This is your self timer. This is an oversized lever for the self timer. Makes it very simple. Here's your flash synchronization post. And you'll notice down here it says MD. The earliest OM-1 cameras, I don't believe, were able to use a motor drive. The location of the shutter speed selector at the base of the lens definitely is an acquired taste. Some people will like it being there because you can access all the controls with one hand. You can access both the aperture and your shutter speed selector with one hand. Some people don't like it because they have gotten used to it being up here where it is on many cameras. Not all cameras, but many cameras. Just be aware that you'll have to make some adjustments to your shooting style when you use one of the OM cameras that have the shutter speed dial here at the base of the lens. On the bottom of the camera, you have a couple things. One is a small hole. This is for the locating pin on the motor winder or motor drive. Next, you have your battery chamber door. Over here, this is a small little cover that you have to remove when you attach a motor winder. This is your coupling for your motor winder. Here are your contact points for the winder, and of course here's your tripod socket, which is in alignment with the center of the lens. This is the Olympus OM Winder 1. Notice that this is a winder, not a motor drive. The difference between a film winder and a motor drive is this advances the film much slower than a motor drive. In fact, with this one, you can only take a single shot at a time. Motor drive sometimes got up, well, depending on the system, could deliver up to 10 frames per second. Of course, in that case, you'd probably want to be using a 250 exposure back, because otherwise you go through an entire roll of 36 exposures in 3.5 seconds. The Olympus film winder takes 4 AA cells. With this, you can use alkaline batteries. With this motor winder, you release the battery tray. I've already popped in some batteries. It has a small little carrier right here for you to insert that cover, that coupling cover. And that's nice because that certainly is one piece that you know is going to get lost. This has a single thumb screw. So all you really do is just align the two and tighten that thumb screw. Now with the motor winder, it does add some bulk to the camera, which you would expect. And this is how it looks. If you use your shutter release, it will not advance the film. Let's turn this motor winder on. And you can see, even if I keep this depressed, it does not have a continuous mode. One frame at a time. But if I were to press the shutter release here, see, it does not advance the film. Now, one advantage to this system is when it's time to rewind the film, generally you're going to have that button that's on the underside of the camera. In this case, you just push this to the right, twist that to the right, and then you can rewind your film. And you don't have to remove the film winder. Of course, a lot of cameras, they'll have like a little switch or something that performs the same function, which is to depress that small button. To open the back of the camera, it's fairly traditional. You just lift up on the rewind knob and the back pops open. The OM-1 uses a horizontally traveling cloth shutter. Film runs traditionally from left to right, and in the back it has what you would expect it to have. That is, has a pressure plate, has these film rails, take-up spool, and a small sprocket spindle. And of course, the role of the pressure plate is to keep the film flat against the film rail, so when you take your photograph, the film is as flat as possible, and you will record as sharp an image as possible, always dependent on your lens being able to record a sharp image. The OM-1 had a large and bright viewfinder. It's fairly simple on the inside with just these little pinchers in the lower left corner and a meter needle that would float up and down to indicate exposure. Overexposure, correct exposure, or underexposure. In 1975, Olympus introduced the OM-2, and then 1 year later, the OM-2 MD. I'm not exactly sure of the production date, but it would have been at least 1975, certainly no sooner. This offered auto exposure and manual exposure. This camera was entirely battery dependent, with the only available shutter speed, should the batteries die, of B. Aside from that, there are no other manual shutter speeds. The layout of this camera is very similar, as far as self-timer, your rewind switch, the location of the shutter speed selection collar, and of course your apertures, that would always be controlled by the lens and not by the camera. On the top deck of the OM-2, you had your meter switch, and you had 3 positions. In the middle, it was off, push upward for auto exposure, and push downward for manual exposure. If you push this all the way to the top toward the front of the camera, it would check the battery, and you'll see the small LED flash. The viewfinder display changed depending on what mode you're in. In auto mode, there's a small shutter speed scale superimposed on the left side of the viewfinder. So that meant that this camera was aperture priority auto exposure. That meant you selected the aperture and the camera will select the shutter speed. If you wanted a faster shutter speed, you would use a larger aperture. If you're really looking to use a certain aperture, you would select that aperture and then use whatever shutter speed that the camera was indicating. In the middle, off there, it removes that. There are no indicators in the viewfinder. And on manual, it slides into place those 2 little pinchers that are very similar to the OM-1. Like the OM-1, it had a bolt-on hot shoe, and you can see how it attaches. Same as the OM-1. You can see an extra electrical contact here, which would indicate that there was a dedicated electronic flash. And I believe I have this flash. I don't know where. It's downstairs somewhere. Here, your film speed dial is slightly different. It's a lift and turn affair. So you lift, hit your desired film speed, then you drop it into place. There's a very small black mark, little hash mark. And so what you would do to always be a correct exposure, not exposure compensation, you would align this long silver or white line with that little black mark. Essentially, you just want this to be horizontal. If you wanted to dial an exposure compensation on auto, you would simply make the change here. The shutter release is in the same location as the OM-1, making it very simple to move between cameras. And then you have your frame counter. On the bottom, the layout is identical to the OM-1. Tripod socket in alignment with the center of the lens. Your battery chamber. In this case, this used 2 button cells, S76, LR44, or today, the Energizer 357 type. As always, try to use a either a lithium or a silver oxide battery. If at all possible, don't use alkaline. Here are your contact points for your motor winder or your motor drive. And that's pretty much it. Let's open the back of this camera, take a quick look, and you're going to see the same layout. You'll see that pressure plate, film runs from left to right, horizontally traveling cloth shutter with your film spindle and your take-up spool. This has a small area for you to tear off that end of the box of film and insert it in there as a reminder as to what type of film you had loaded, whereas the OM-1 did not have that. Now with the OM-2, what happens if you run out of batteries? As I mentioned, it only has one shutter speed, and that's B. What happens if you press the shutter release and your batteries have already drained but you weren't aware of it? Well, what will happen is the mirror will go up and the shutter will never release. There's a small tab here, and you'll see it's right next to this small red dot. Simply press that, turn your shutter speed dial to B, and it will release the shutter and lower the mirror. That is, if you did want to try to estimate a slower shutter speed and not B, you would simply press the shutter release and release it as quickly as possible. Of course, it's also very likely that you're going to introduce some vibrations, but that is a different matter. Placed back to back, you can see they're pretty much very similar in shape. That would be including how the top deck is actually comes to a small point here instead of being rounded or flat. Looking at two cameras from the front, they appear to be quite similar, except although this one says OM-2. As I mentioned, these weren't the original models when they were introduced. These were introduced slightly afterward. Each of these has a small MD badge on it. Let's take a look at the weight of these two cameras. Because these two cameras have different lenses attached to them, I'm going to weigh only the bodies for right now. The OM-1 weighs 1 pound 2 ounces, and the OM-2 weighs 1 pound 3 ounces. Presumably, there's some extra circuitry in here for the auto exposure, which adds 1 ounce to the body. Let's see what the OM-1 weighs with first the f1.8 standard lens. That comes in at 1 pound 8 ounces, or 1.5 pounds. Now with the faster 1.4 lens, the weight of it now jumps to 1 pound 10 ounces, which is a 2 ounce difference from the 1.8 version of the lens. I know that there are different versions of all the Olympus lenses. I couldn't really tell you what they are, but for those people who are really dedicated to the Olympus OM-1 cameras and its history, they have a better understanding of that. I'm not going to try to tackle it. So if we were to add the winder to it, now you're talking 2 pounds 7 ounces, or almost 2.5 pounds. Once again, let's do something very quick. And because we showed off that Pentax Spotmatic SP1000, let's weigh that with its standard lens. It's like 112.5, slightly more than 112.5. So that automatically is 4.5 ounces heavier. And that's fairly comparable. This is an f2 lens. I don't have the 1.7 or 1.8 version of this. What if we just jump right to the Pentax K1000? Pretty much the same thing. In fact, this is just ever so slightly lighter than the SP1000, coming in at 1 pound 11.9 or 1 pound 12 ounces. The OM-1 was a great camera when it was released and followed up by the OM-2. Several other models followed, and including, I think there was a titanium version of the OM-4. All were held in very high regard. Later, there were several other cameras, but those were consumer-only cameras. At one time, I owned the OM-10. That was definitely a consumer-level model because you could just tell that its quality of construction wasn't the same as these two models. The OM system gained a very loyal following and well-deserved. Olympus really got things right out of the gate. Of course, today, the original OMs, you're going to have to either figure out what to do about that battery situation because the mercury cells, that 1.35 volt mercury cell is no longer available. I think you can probably use a a hearing aid battery at 1.4 volts. The differences in voltage is only 3.7%, and that really shouldn't cause a problem. The one thing that I wish that all camera makers had done is when you attach the motor winder, that it also supplied electrical power to the camera itself. For some reason, camera makers never thought of that, and so you always had to use both. You always had to insert cameras into the battery as well as into the drive. The viewfinder in this camera, the OM-1, does not have a split image focusing aid. It just has a central spot, whereas the OM-2 does have the split image. It's possible that someone changed the viewfinder. Perhaps it did have a split image in the viewfinder. That I don't know. I'll tell you right now, I'm not a historian when it comes to these cameras. I am just a user and someone who appreciates the workmanship that went into these. The OM series continues to be thought of quite highly today. Although with the cameras that I've purchased, one of the big problems for some reason is mold affecting the viewfinder prisms. I don't know why, but I think I think 2 of 3 OM2s that I bought have had mold in the viewfinder. And in fact, this one looks like it's developing it now, so I might pull that prism again and take a quick look at it. And it might just be sheer coincidence that this occurred with this camera. One of the things that the Olympus lenses were noted for is supposedly they had excellent contrast, better contrast than lenses from other cameras, which meant, you would get more punch and more contrast the image, of course. Whiter whites, deeper blacks. So I rated the original OM-1 as 9.1 and the OM-2 is 9.0, with the primary difference being the battery dependence of the OM-2 and the fact that if your batteries failed, you were left with a single, really not usable shutter speed of B. Obviously, if you're shooting a battery-dependent camera, you should always have an extra set on in your bag for that reason. Because although you sometimes think, my batteries are fine, next thing you know, batteries are dead and you are no longer able to take any photographs. So that's my take on the Olympus OM-1 and OM-2, which brings us to the end of this video. If you like this video, don't forget to give me a like and or subscribe, and feel free to leave a comment below, or send me an email at contact@camera-talk.net. And don't forget to click the Camera Talk icon in the lower right corner of the screen for more content about cameras and photography. And I'll see you on the next video.